Miles Davis was one of the best known and most influential jazz trumpeters the world has ever known. He is credited with being at the forefront of several types of jazz, modal jazz in the late 50s and early 60s, and jazz rock fusion in the late 60s and early 70s, probably the most prominent. He was active from 1944 until his death in 1991, with a short hiatus between 1975 and 1980. I think he made 56 studio albums. He also is the act with the most albums in this list of albums that I'm working from, which is a total of 21 albums in this list. Hi, my name's Dan. So this is obviously an album by Miles Davis. I'm afraid I can't show the cover because the picture on it is... You see, most people wouldn't object to it, but I'm just uber careful on this channel. And so there's some it's painted, but there's some nudity on it. It's quite a nice cover actually. So if you're not offended by that kind of thing, by all means go look at it. Easy to find on the internet. It's from the name of the album, you might imagine it's a live album. It's kind of only partially live, so there's some live tracks and there's some studio tracks, but actually the live tracks are pieced together from bits from different sets and different takes, and with some studio bits edited in as well, so it's kind of all edited up. If you want details on that, there's copious details on the Wikipedia page, which I'll be linking down below. I would describe this as somewhere in the jazz rock funk fusion kind of area. So there's definitely jazz elements in here, but there's definitely very much kind of rock and funk elements as well in here. And it's a double album, and it's quite long at just under 102 minutes, and there's only 8 tracks. So you can work out from that most of the tracks are pretty long. Most of them take the form of jammed improvisations, and this was obviously what they were doing on the stage. They were improvising, which is one way of saying making it up as you go along. So we've got a whole load of names involved and a lot of instruments involved. Not always the same people on the same track, on all the tracks. The names that jumped out at me, and this is by no means all the names, are of course Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on electric piano, Chick Corea also on electric piano, John McLaughlin, who took the name Mahavishnu later, on electric guitar, Keith Jarrett on organ, and Billy Cobham on drums. Now, in some tracks, there's 2 drummers. There's often multiple keyboards going on. The bass is sometimes acoustic, sometimes electric bass. Yeah, I'm going to do some context. I don't often do stuff to contextualize the albums that I'm talking about. I think for me it was important, so I'll talk about it. So Miles Davis has the distinction of being the person, the act who has more albums on this list of the 3,000 greatest albums of all time than anybody else. And he had quite a high profile and in some ways controversial musically period, which is around this period called, I think, often called his Electric period. But this comes after 2 of his very high profile albums, In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. Those I've heard both of those albums. I wouldn't be able to sing any of the tunes for you because it's not that kind of stuff. This album is kind of semi-structured chaos, but it felt to me like it was. I responded to it better than some of his other albums around the same period. So it's definitely a case where you've got some amazing musicians here, and they're improvising and they're playing off each other, and you can hear that process going on. Many of the people who are here involved in this, some of these names that I've read out, people who go on to make quite a big deal for themselves in the fusion world. they kind of spread off in different directions. You got Herbie Hancock and John McLaughlin, who made the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Chick Corea with Return to Forever. And they all, to a certain extent, crossed over at that point from jazz into jazz rock fusion. And often a lot of the stuff that they do is very complex. This is simpler than that, but it has. I found it less challenging than some of the Miles Davis albums that had come just before this, and I think that's probably because of the greater emphasis on the rock funk elements in here. So some of it felt like, again, I'm going to reference something else. It felt like the later progressive rock improvisation of King Crimson. Certainly, as you get into the Discipline and the Thrash era, some of their stuff is, quite some similarities to this. Obviously, this is later than this album is earlier than the King Crimson stuff. Some of it just sounds like jams, quite musical in that sense. And that, uh, yeah, it sounds like a strange thing to say about an album of music. Um, Three of the tracks are entirely studio tracks and are compositions by, I will pronounce this wrong, Hermeto Pascoal, who's a Brazilian jazz composer, and he's credited as playing drums and doing vocals and whistling on one track. Those tracks actually don't have much in the way of drums. Mostly they're kind of held sustained notes, so it's more of a sort of thing. I want to use soundscape kind of music scape. There are held dissonances and there's held harmony as well that works in that, and they're interesting. But thankfully, they're not as long as some of the others because they're not as interesting in length as some of the other tracks are. So um, I feel that I've approached this is kind of it's like a bridge between the jazz side and the rock side. And the jazz side is the side that I don't really understand, and the rock side is the side that I do understand in this kind of improv stuff. And I feel that the similarity to the rock side of this is greater. This I think this is why I responded to it better than some of his other albums of the time. So maybe I just understood it more than I do the jazz side, and maybe I just kind of more comfortable in this kind of improvisation. Ultimately, it is quite a long album, and it's somewhat odd. I think my comfort with it comes from exposure to similar things coming through the rock side, and if you don't have that, and it's not conventional musically most of the time. There are sections which you would say were fairly conventional. So I reasonably enjoyed it. I still didn't get overboard. To be honest, I feel like if it was half the length, I might have responded better to it. But actually, maybe if it was tighter, because it's a bit kind of. I tend to often like expansive things, but I think this rambles just maybe a bit too much for me. So I've said enough. That's what I think of this album, and I'd love to know what you think. So please do leave a comment in the comments box. And that's it from me for now.